Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Hello. It's Wednesday. It's the last Wednesday of April. For our members, it is the 5th Wednesday of the month, which means you can watch us, weird, strange, unusual people, take weird, strange, unusual quizzes. Yeah, we do BuzzFeed quizzes because they're fun and weird and they make no sense, but that's okay. We don't make any sense, so that's all right. We've got a robot race for our video today, and our video is a piece of history. Happened during the Vietnam War, the war that nobody agrees upon. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. All right, and then start. There we go. We got She Stole, Keep Digging. There's Ron. There's Rock. There's my Linda. There's Laura. There's Wisdom. There's Stace. There's New. There's Pinned and Eric. And Railroad. Northern Woman. Crazy Train. There's Vaughn. There's Lucia. Let's see here. There's Nacha Daly. Shantester, Jacob, Garden, Mike's Garden, Zoll, Blistering, M&J, there's Vi, Laura, Carol, let's see, who else is we got? There's Carnival, looks like it's going to be Ron, hang on a minute. All right, this is Mr. Ron's Adventures. Name is Ron, and I had a stroke in 2018, which affected speech and a bit of memory. Recently got back on YouTube. It helps me keep my mind motivated and keeps me walking and exploring my community. And that's one of the reasons why we started doing things, is it does kind of motivate to get out there. As fluffier people, it isn't always easy to do that, and so I understand where he's coming from, and good on him. We've got a parade that he did 6 months ago. We've got some shorts, and then, of course, his videos. And videos are traveling and outdoor, the kind of stuff, so check him out. He's wonderful, very supportive. Like, share, comment, and have a good day. All right, missed you, bud. Tell them something interesting that's historically interesting. That made sense.
That makes more sense.
I know stuff.
You don't know stuff.
I know nothing.
You draw lines and make question marks and all that good stuff. So now, every once in a while we get to throw out something. It's kind of a dark piece of history, but you cover the good, the bad, the ugly, everything across the board. And the day that we're going to play with, April the 30th, went down in history for being known as the fall of Saigon. For those of you guys who know that I enjoy history, that Vietnam War was, you almost want to say that we were stuck on the wrong side, but also that we were fighting an enemy that we had a real hard time figuring out what to do, because they were using kids, and we were fighting our own battles back home. All of a sudden wars were being televised, on the 5 o'clock news. You were seeing actions take place that hadn't been seen back in Korea or World War II.
never thought about that, but that's a very good point.
There was a lot of publicity that came out, and as well there was a lot of negative aspects that, people would call it an unpopular war, which to a degree I can see, but at the same time, the biggest hurdle that we had was that we were trying to stop an expansion of communism. And even before we got into it, the French were trying to stop, the communists in the northern part of Vietnam, and it divided the country. Both parts were all Vietnamese. We stepped in to try to keep the South free, and eventually what wound up happening is that the number of wounded and died over there, we couldn't tolerate it anymore. And so one of the first things that they tried to do is that they were trying to train the Vietnamese to fight like we do, with rifles, pistols, grenades. Slowly we started pulling out. And it worked to a degree. We started getting a number of our POWs back. The only problem is that towards the end of our exit from Vietnam, one of the most critical factors was going to be financing. Because, let's put it bluntly, our economic effect in South Vietnam was critical. They were talking about times when you would have bullets. A machine gun is a great weapon if you have full clips of ammunition, and you can use them.
What?
It doesn't do a whole lot of good to have a machine gun with 3 bullets in a 20 bullet clip.
Probably not.
Oops! Look at that amount of ammunition. But anyway, some of the things that they talk about is that various names were stuck on these events. The Vietnamese government would officially call it the Day of Liberation of the South and National Reunification, or Liberation Day. While the term Fall of Saigon is commonly used in Western accounts, it was ultimately called the Day the Country Was Lost, Black April, National Day of Shame, or National Day of Resentment.
Ouch!
Yeah, kind of harsh.
Ow!
The more neutral name, April 30th, 1975 incident, or simply April 30th. Now, what this basically all tied into was the 1975 Spring Offensive. The rapid actions from which the South Vietnamese position collapsed was surprising to most American and South Vietnamese observers, probably due to the North Vietnamese and their allies as well. A memo from our buddies at the CIA, and as they said, an oxymoron, the U.S. Army Intelligence, published on the 5th of March, indicated that the South Vietnamese could hold out through the current dry season, at least until 1976. Well, these predictions proved to be grievously in error.
What? No.
Yep. Even as the memo was being released, Diem was preparing a major offensive into the central highlands of Vietnam that began on the 10th of March and led to the capture of Buon Ma Thuot. The ARVN began a disorderly and costly retreat, hoping to redeploy forces and hold the southern part of South Vietnam south of the 13th parallel. Well, supported by artillery and armor, the PAVN continued to march towards Saigon, capturing the major cities of northern South Vietnam at the end of March, Hue on the 25th and Da Nang on the 28th. Now, along the way, disorderly South Vietnamese retreats and the flight of refugees, there were more than 300,000 in Da Nang, damaged the South Vietnamese prospects for a turnaround. Well, after the loss of Da Nang, those prospects had already been dismissed as non-existent by the CIA officers in Vietnam, who believed nothing short of B-52 strikes against Hanoi could possibly stop the North Vietnamese. I would probably agree with that. Now, by the 8th of April, the North Vietnamese Politburo, which in March had recommended caution to Duke, cabled him to demand unremitting vigor in the attack all the way to the heart of Saigon. Well, on the 14th of April, they renamed the campaign the Ho Chi Minh Campaign after revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh in hopes to wrapping it up before his birthday on the 19th of May. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese failed to garner any significant increase in military aid from the U.S. Again, financial aid went south, snuffing out President Nguyen Van Thieu's hope for a renewed American support. On the 9th of April, the PAVN forces reached Nong Loc, the last line of defense before Saigon, where the ARVN 18th Division made a last stand and held the city through fierce fighting for 11 days.
Wow.
The ARVN finally withdrew from Nong Loc on the 20th of April, having inflicted heavy losses on the PRVN, and President Thieu resigned on the 21st in a tearful televised announcement in which he denounced the United States for failing to come to the aid of the South. Well, the North Vietnamese front line was now just 26 miles from downtown Saigon. Now, the victory at Nong Loc, which had drawn many South Vietnamese troops away from the Mekong Delta area, opened the way for the PAVN to encircle Saigon, and they soon did so, moving 100,000 troops in position around the city by the 27th of April.
Wow.
Yep, with the ARVN having few defenders, the fate of the city was effectively sealed. Well, the ARVN 3rd Corps commander, General Nguyen Van Ton, had organized 5 centers of resistance to defend the city. These fronts were connected as to form an arc enveloping the entire area west, north, and east of the capital. The Chu Chi front to the northwest was defended by 25th Division. The Big Dome front to the north was the responsibility of the 5th Division. The Bien Hoa front to the northeast was defended by the 18th Division. The Vung Tau and the 15 route front to the southeast were held by the 1st Airborne Brigade, and 1 battalion of the 3rd Division and the Long An front, for which the Capital Military District Command was responsible, was defended by elements of the reformed 22nd Division. The South Vietnamese defense forces around Saigon totaled about 60,000 troops. However, as the exodus made it into Saigon, along with the many ARVN soldiers, which swelled the men under arms in the city to well over 250,000 soldiers. So there was quite a few guys in the city. Now, sadly, these units were mostly battered and leaderless, which threw the city into further anarchy. Now, with the rapid advances in March and early April led to the increased concern in Saigon that the city, which had been fairly peaceful throughout the war and whose people had endured relatively little suffering, was soon to come under direct attack. Many feared that once the communists took control of the city, a bloodbath of reprisals would soon take place. In 1968, when the PAVN and the VC forces had occupied Hue for close to a month, after they were ejected, American and ARVN forces had found mass graves.
Wow.
A study indicated that the VC had targeted ARVN officers, Catholics, intellectuals, businessmen, and other suspected counter-revolutionaries. More recently, 8 Americans captured and 1 thought had vanished, and reports of beheadings and other executions were filtered through from Hue and Da Nang, mostly spurred on by government propaganda. Most Americans and citizens of other countries allied to the United States wanted to evacuate the city before it fell, and many of South Vietnamese, especially those associated with the U.S. or South Vietnam government, wanted to leave as well. I wouldn't blame them.
What? No, we should stay.
Yeah. Well, as early as the end of March, some Americans were leaving the city. Flights out of Saigon, lightly booked under ordinary circumstances, were full. Throughout April, the speed of the evacuation was increasing as the Defense Attaché Office began to fly out non-essential personnel. Many Americans attached to the DAO refused to leave without their Vietnamese friends and dependents, who included common law wives and children. It was illegal for the DAO to move these people to American soil, and this initially slowed down the rate of departure, but eventually the DAO began illegally flying undocumented Vietnamese to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Well, on the 3rd of April, President Gerald Ford announced Operation Baby Lift, which would evacuate about 2,000 orphans from the country. One of the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy planes involved in the operation crashed, killing 155 passengers and crew and seriously reducing the morale of the American staff. In addition to over 2,500 orphans evacuated by Baby Lift, Operation New Life resulted in the evacuation of over 110,000 Vietnamese refugees. The final evacuation was Operation Frequent Wind, which resulted in 7,000 people being evacuated from Saigon by helicopter. Well, by this time, the Ford administration had also begun planning for a complete evacuation of their American presence. The planning was complicated by practical, legal, and strategic concerns. The administration was divided on how swift the evacuations should be. The Pentagon sought to evacuate as fast as possible to avoid the risk of casualties or other accidents. The U.S. ambassador to the South Vietnamese, Graham Martin, was technically the field commander for any evacuation, since evacuations are part of the purview of the State Department. Martin would draw the ire of many in the Pentagon by wishing to keep the evacuation process as quiet and as orderly as possible. His desire was for the present to prevent total chaos and to deflect the real possibility of South Vietnamese turning against Americans and to keep all-out bloodshed from occurring.
I mean, that seems like a good goal.
Yeah.
Ford, that seems like a really good goal.
Really good goal there, dude. Ford approved a plan between the extremes of which all but 1,250 Americans, few enough to be removed in a single day's helicopter airlift, would be evacuated quickly. The remaining 1,250 would only leave when the airport was threatened. In the meantime, as many Vietnamese refugees as possible would be flown out. Now, American evacuation planning was set against the Ford administration's other policies. Ford still hoped that he would be able to gain additional military aid for South Vietnam. Throughout April, he attempted to get Congress behind a proposed appropriation of $722 million, which might cover the cost of reconstitution of some of the South Vietnamese forces that had been destroyed. Well, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was opposed to a full-scale evacuation as long as the aid option remained on the table, because the removal of American forces would signal a loss of faith into and seriously weaken him. There was also the concern in the administration over whether the use of military forces to support and carry out the evacuation was permitted under the newly passed War Powers Act. Eventually, the White House lawyers determined that the use of American forces to rescue citizens in an emergency was unlikely to run afoul of the law, but the legality of using military assets to withdraw refugees was unknown. Well, while American citizens were generally assured of a simple way to leave the country just by showing up to an evacuation point, the South Vietnamese who wanted to leave Saigon before it fell resorted to independent arrangements. The under-the-table payments required to gain a passport and exit visa jumped sixfold, and the price of seagoing vessels tripled. For those who owned property in the city were often forced to sell it at substantial loss or abandon it altogether, and the asking price of one particularly impressive house was cut 75% within a 2-week period. American visas were of enormous value, and the Vietnamese seeking American sponsors posted advertisements in newspapers. One such ad read, "Seeking adoptive parents, poor, diligent students," followed by names, birthdates, and identity card numbers. Disproportionate fraction of Vietnamese in the 1975 wave of immigration, who later achieved refugee status in the U.S., were former members of the South Vietnamese government and military. Though most expected to find political and personal freedom in the U.S. on account of their anti-communist bona fides, they often encountered an unexpected and complex resettlement process involving stays in U.S. military-operated processing centers for various lengths of time before they could begin their new lives in America. Well, as the North Vietnamese chipped away at more and more of South Vietnam's territory, internal opposition to Thieu continued to accumulate. For instance, in early April, the Senate unanimously voted through a call for new leadership, and some top military commanders were pressing for a coup. In response to this pressure, Thieu made some changes in his cabinet, and Prime Minister Tran Thuy Kim resigned. This did little to reduce the opposition to Thieu, and on the 8th of April, the South Vietnamese pilot and secret communist Nguyen Thanh Truong bombed the Independent Palace and then flew to a PA Van-controlled airstrip. Thieu was not hurt. Now, many in the American mission, Martin in particular, along with some key figures in Washington, believed that negotiations with the communists were still possible even if Saigon could stabilize the military situation. Martin's hope was that the North Vietnamese leaders would be willing to allow a phased withdrawal, whereby a gradual departure might be achieved to allow helpful locals and all Americans to leave, along with a full military withdrawal over a period of several months. And opinions were divided on whether any government which would be headed by Thieu could affect such a political situation. The foreign minister of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, the PRG, had indicated on April 2nd that the PRG might negotiate with the Saigon government that did not include Thieu. Thus, even among Thieu's supporters, pressure was growing for his ouster. Well, again, Thieu resigned on the 21st of April. His remarks were particularly hard on Americans, first for forcing South Vietnam to accede to the Paris Peace Accords, and second for failing to support South Vietnam afterwards, and all the while asking South Vietnam to do the impossible thing, like filling up the oceans with stones. The presidency was turned over to Vice President Truong Van Huong, and the view of the North Vietnamese government, broadcast by Radio Hanoi, was that the new regime was merely another puppet regime. Well, on the 27th of April, Saigon was hit by PAVN rockets, the first in more than 40 months. With his overtures to the north rebuffed out of hand, Tran resigned on the 28th of April and was succeeded by General DuongVat Minh. Minh took over a regime that by this time was in a state of utter collapse. He had long-standing ties with the communists, and it was hoped that he could negotiate a ceasefire. However, Hanoi was in no mood to negotiate. On the 28th of April, PAVN forces had fought their way into the outskirts of the city. At the Newport Bridge, about 5 kilometers from the city center, the VC seized Towlin area of the eastern end of the bridge and attempted to seize the bridge, but were repulsed by the ARVN 12th Airborne Battalion. As Duan Hoa was falling, Tuan fled to Saigon, informing the government that most of the top ARVN leadership had virtually resigned themselves to defeat. At 1806, on the 28th of April, as Minh finished his acceptance speech, 3 A-37 Dragonflies, piloted by former Republic of Vietnam Air Force pilots who had defected to the Vietnamese People's Air Force after the fall of Da Nang, dropped 6 250-pound bombs on the Ton Son Nhut Air Base, damaging aircraft. The RVNAF F-5s took off in pursuit, but they were unable to intercept the A-37s. C-130s leaving Ton Son Nhut reported receiving PAVN 51 caliber and 37 millimeter anti-aircraft fire, while sporadic PAVN rocket and artillery attacks also started to hit the airport and airbase. C-130 flights were stopped temporarily after the air attack, but resumed at 2000 on the 28th of April. Well, at 3:58 a.m. on the 29th of April, a C-130E, flown by a crew from the 776th Tactical Airlift Squadron, was destroyed by a 122 millimeter rocket while taxiing to pick up refugees after offloading a BLU-82 at the base. The crew evacuated the burning aircraft on the taxiway and departed the airfield on another C-130 that had previously landed. This was the last USAF fixed-wing aircraft to leave Tan Son Nhat. At dawn of the 29th of April, the RVNAF began to haphazardly depart Tan Son Nhat Air Force Base as A-37s, F-5s, C-7s, C-119s, and C-130s departed for Thailand, while UH-1s took off in search of ships of Task Force 76. Some RVNAF aircraft stayed to continue the fight against on advancing PAVN forces. One AC-119 gunship had spent the night of the 28th and 29th dropping flares and firing on the approaching forces. At dawn of the 29th, two A-1 Sky Raiders began patrolling the perimeter of the Tan Son Nhat at 2,500 feet until one was shot down, presumably by an SA-7 missile. At 7 o'clock, the AC-119 was firing on PAVNs to the east of the airfield when it too was hit by an SA-7 and fell to flames to the ground. At 6 o'clock on the 29th, Doug was ordered by the Politburo to strike with the greatest determination straight into the enemy's final lair. After one day of bombardment and the general offensive, the PAVN were ready to make their final push into the city. Well, at 8 o'clock on the 29th, Lieutenant General Tran Van Min, commander of the RVNAF, and 30 of his staff arrived at the DAO compound demanding evacuation, signifying the complete loss of the RVNAF command and control. Well, the continuing rocket fire and debris on the runways at Tan Son Nhat caused General Homer D. Smith, the U.S. Defense Attaché in Saigon, to advise Martin that the runways were unfit for use and that the emergency evacuation of Saigon would need to be completed by helicopter. Originally, Martin had intended to effect the evacuation by use of fixed-wing aircraft from the base. The plan was altered at a critical time when the South Vietnamese pilots decided to defect and jettison his ordnance along with the only runways still in use, which had not yet been destroyed by shelling. Well, under pressure by Kissinger, Martin forced Marine Guards to take him to Tan Son Nhat in the midst of the continued shelling so he might personally assess the situation. Don't believe the guys that were just at the airfield. How dare you?
What do they know? Maybe
No
they're lying.
They're clueless. Come on, guys. Look, he's getting shot at. Anyway, this decision he did not want to make without a first-hand knowledge of the situation on the ground in case the helicopter lift failed. Martin gave the green light for the helicopter evacuation to begin in earnest. Well, reports came in from the outskirts of the city that the PAVN were closing in.
No.
At 10:48 a.m., Martin relayed to Kissinger his desire to activate Operation Frequent Wind, the helicopter evacuation of the U.S. personnel and at-risk Vietnamese. At 10:51 on the 29th, an order was given by SINPAC to commence Operation Frequent Wind. The American radio stations began the regular play of Irving Berlin's White Christmas, the signal for American personnel to move immediately to the evacuation points. Well,
Middle of April, let's play White Christmas for reasons.
Yeah, it's like, why are they
That
playing
sounds suspicious
that
anyway.
song at all? Yeah. Now, under this plan, CH-53s and CH-46 helicopters were used to evacuate Americans and friendly Vietnamese to ships, including the 7th Fleet, in the South China Sea. The main evacuation point was the DAO compound in Tan Son Nhat. Buses moved through the city picking up passengers and driving them out to the airport, with the first buses arriving at Tan Son Nhat shortly after noon. The first CH-53 landed at the DAO compound in the afternoon, and by the evening, 395 Americans and more than 4,000 Vietnamese had been evacuated.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. By 11 p.m. in the evening, the U.S. Marines were providing security, were withdrawing and arranging the demolition of the DAO office, American equipment, files, and cash. Air America UH-1s are also participating in this evacuation. Now, the original evacuation plans had not called for a large-scale helicopter operation at the U.S. Embassy. Helicopters and buses were used to shuttle people from the embassy to the DAO compound. However, in the course of the evacuation, it turned out that a few thousand people had turned out at the embassy and were stranded there, including many Vietnamese. Additional Vietnamese civilians gathered outside the embassy and scaled the walls, hoping to claim refugee status. Thunderstorms increased the difficulty of helicopter operations. Nevertheless, the evacuation from the embassy continued more or less unbroken throughout the evening and night. Well, at 3:45 a.m. on the morning of April the 30th, Kissinger and Ford ordered Martin to evacuate only Americans from that point forward. Reluctantly, Martin announced that the only Americans would be flown out due to the worry that the North Vietnamese would soon take the city in the Ford administration's desire to announce the completion of the American evacuation. Martin was ordered by Ford to board of the evacuation helicopter. The call sign of that helicopter was Lady Ace 9, and the pilot carried direct orders from Ford for Martin to be on board. The pilot, Jerry Berry, had the orders written in grease pencil on his knee pads. Martin's wife Dorothy had already been evacuated by previous flights and left behind her suitcase so a South Vietnamese woman might be able to squeeze on board with her. Lady Ace 9 from USMC Squadron HMM 165, piloted by Berry, took off at 4:58. Though he didn't know it, had Martin refused to leave, the Marines had a reserve order to arrest him and carry him away to ensure his safety. The embassy evacuation had flown out 798 Marines and about 1,100 Vietnamese. The Marines who had been securing the embassy followed at dawn, with their last aircraft leaving at 7:53. 420 Vietnamese and South Koreans were left behind in the embassy compound, with an additional crowd gathering outside the walls. The Americans and the refugees they flew out were generally allowed to leave without intervention from either the North or South Vietnamese. Pilots of helicopters heading to Tan Son were aware that the PAVN anti-aircraft guns were tracking them, but they refrained from firing. The Hanoi leadership, reckoning that the completion of the evacuation would lessen the risk of American intervention, had instructed them not to target the airlift itself. Meanwhile, members of the police in Saigon had been promised evacuation in exchange for protecting the American evacuation buses and control of the crowds in the city during the evacuation. Although this was the end of the American military operation, Vietnamese continued to leave the country by boat and, where possible, by aircraft. RVNAF pilots who had access to helicopters would fly them offshore to the American fleet where they were able to land. Many RVNAF helicopters were dumped into the ocean to make room on the decks for more aircraft. RVNAF fighters and other planes also sought refuge in Thailand, where two O-1s landed on the USS Midway. While Martin was flown out to the USS Blue Ridge, where he pleaded for helicopters to return to the embassy compounds to pick up the few hundred remaining hopefuls waiting to be evacuated. Though his pleas were overruled by Ford, Martin was able to convince the 7th Fleet to remain on station for several days so any locals who could make their way to the sea via boat or aircraft might be rescued by the waiting Americans. Many Vietnamese nationals who were evacuated were allowed to enter the United States under the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act. Decades later, when the U.S. government reestablished diplomatic relations with Vietnam, the former embassy building was returned to the United States. The historic staircase that led to the rooftop helicopter pad in the nearby apartment building, used by the CIA and other U.S. government employees, was salvaged and is on permanent display at the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've seen pictures of that.
Yeah.
Now, in the early hours of the 30th April, Doug received his orders from the Politburo to attack. He ordered his field commanders to advance directly to key facilities and strategic points within the city. The first PAVN unit to enter the city was the 324th Division. By now, the government had not made any sort of appeals to the people for donations of blood, food, etc. On the morning, PAVN sappers attempted to seize the Newport Bridge but were repulsed by the ARVN airborne. At 9 a.m., the PRVN tank column approached the bridge and came under fire from ARVN tanks, which destroyed the lead T-54, killing the battalion commander. The ARVN's 3rd Task Force, 81st Ranger Group, commanded by Major Palm Chowtai, defended Townsend, and they were joined by remnants of the Low Hull unit. At 7:15 a.m. on the 30th of April, the PAVN 24th Regiment approached the Bay Head intersection, 1.5 kilometers from the main gate of the airbase. The lead T-54 was hit by a M67 recoilless rifle, and then the next T-54 was hit by a shell from an M48 tank. The PAVN infantry moved forward and engaged the ARVN in house-to-house fighting, forcing them to withdraw to the base by 8:45 a.m. The PAVN then sent 3 tanks and an infantry battalion to assault the main gate, and they were met by intense anti-tank and machine gun fire, knocking out the 3 tanks and killing at least 20 PAVN soldiers. The PAVN tried to bring forward a 85mm anti-aircraft gun, but the ARVN knocked it out before it could start firing. The PAVN 10th Division ordered 8 more tanks and another infantry battalion to join the attack, but as they approached the Bay Head intersection, they were hit by an airstrike from RV NAF jets operating from Bentoy Air Base, which destroyed 2 T-54s. The 6 surviving tanks arrived at the main gate at 10 o'clock to begin their attack, and the 2 being knocked out by anti-aircraft fire in front of the gate, and another destroyed it as attempting a flanking maneuver. Also on the 30th, as the People's Army of Vietnam 2nd Corps Deep Penetration Unit advanced towards Saigon, soldiers at Tu Duc Military Academy engaged the PAVN armored column on Route 15. Several tanks were detached to deal with the resistance, and one was destroyed before the soldiers at the academy surrendered. At 10:24, Min announced an unconditional surrender. He ordered all ARVN troops to cease hostilities in calm and stay where they are, while inviting the Provisional Revolutionary Government to engage in a ceremony and orderly transfer of power as to avoid any unnecessary bloodshed in the population. Around 10:30, the Palm at Tan Son Air Base heard the surrender broadcast and went to the Joint General Staff compound to seek instructions. He called Min to tell him to prepare to surrender. Palm reportedly told Min, "If the Viet Cong tanks are entering Independence Palace, we will come down there to rescue you, sir." Min refused Palm's suggestion, and Palm told him that his men were to withdraw from the base gates. At 11:30 a.m., the PAVN entered the base. At Newport Bridge, the ARVN and the PAVN continued to exchange tank and artillery fire until the ARVN commander received Min's capitulation order over the radio. While the bridge was rigged with approximately 4,000 pounds of demolition charges, the ARVN stood down, and at 10:30 the PAVN crossed the bridge. Well, the PAVN 203rd Tank Brigade from 2nd Corps of Major General Nguyen Hat An, under the command of Commander Nguyen Tao Tat and Political Commissar Louis Tang Tuk, were the first units to burst through the gates of the Independent Palace around noon. Tank 843, a Soviet T-54, was the first to directly hit and strike the side of the palace.
Oops.
This historic moment was recorded by Australian cameraman Neil Davis. Tank 390, a Chinese Type 59 tank, then crashed through the main gate in the middle to enter the front yard. For many years, the official record of the Vietnamese government and international historical sources maintained that Tank 843 was the first one to enter the presidential palace. However, in 1995, French war photographer François de Milner published her photo showing that Tank 390 entered the main gate while Tank 843 was still behind the steel columns of the smaller gate on the right hand. Still behind the steel gates on the right side. View from inside with the Tank 843's commander, Louis Tuay Tang, was running with the Viet Cong flag in his hand. Both tanks were declared national treasures in 2012, and each was displayed in a different museum in Hanoi.
Woo.
Lieutenant Boy-Tung Tung pulled down the flag of South Vietnam on top of the palace and raised the Vietnam flag at 10:30 a.m. on the 30th of April, 1975. Now, Tank Brigade 203 soldiers entered the palace and found Min and all a member of his cabinet sitting and waiting for them. The political commissar, Lieutenant Colonel Boy-Tung Tung, arrived at the palace 10 minutes after the first tanks. Min realized that this is the highest-ranking officer around them, then said, "We are waiting to hand over the cabinet." Tung replied immediately, "You have nothing to hand over but your unconditional surrender to us." Tung then wrote a speech announcing the surrender and dissolution of what remained of the South Vietnamese government. He then escorted Min to Radio Saigon to read it to avoid further needless bloodshed. The surrender announcement was recorded by German journalist Boris Glass tape recorder. Colonel Bui Tin, a military journalist, was at the palace around noon to witness the events. In his memoir, he confirmed that Lieutenant Colonel Wayback was one of who accepted the surrender and wrote the statement for Min. However, in an interview with WGBH Educational Foundation in 1981, he falsely claimed that he was the first high officer who met Min and accepted the surrender with Tung's words. This claim was repeated after his defection from Vietnam and sometimes cited mistakenly by foreign correspondents and historians. At 2:30, Min announced the formal surrender of South Vietnam as, quote, "I, General Duong Van Minh, President of the Saigon administration, appeal to the armed forces of the Republic of Vietnam to lie down their arms and surrender unconditionally to the forces of the Liberation Army of South Vietnam. Furthermore, I declare that the Saigon government is completely dissolved at all levels. From the central government to the local governments must be handed over to the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam." Wayback Tung then took the microphone and announced, "We, the representatives for the forces of the Liberation Army of South Vietnam, solemnly declare that the city of Saigon was completely liberated. We accepted the unconditional surrender of General Duong Thanh Minh, the President of the Saigon administration." This announcement marked the end of the Vietnam War. Now, the communists would go ahead and rename the city Ho Chi Minh City after the leader of North Vietnam, former president. Although, interestingly enough, the name Saigon still applies to the city by many of the residents and others. Order would slowly be restored, although by then the deserted U.S. Embassy was looted, along with many other businesses. Communications between the outside world and Saigon were cut. The Viet Cong machinery in South Vietnam was weakened, owing in part to the Phoenix program, so that the PAVN was responsible for maintaining order, and General Chang Van Tra, Doug's administrative deputy, was placed in charge of the city. The new authorities would hold a victory rally on the 7th of May. Now, one objective of the Communist Party of Vietnam was to reduce the population of Saigon, which had become swollen with the influx of people during the war and was now overcrowded with high unemployment. Re-education classes for former soldiers of the ARVN indicated that to regain full standing in society, they would need to move from the city and take up farming. Handouts of rice to the poor, while forthcoming, were tied to pledges to leave Saigon for the countryside. According to the Vietnamese government, within 2 years of the capture of the city, 1 million people had left Saigon, and the state had a target of 500,000 further departures. So, following the end of the war, according to the official and non-official estimates, between 200,000 and 300,000 South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, where many endured torture, starvation, and disease while they were being forced to do hard labor. Now, whether the evacuation had been successful or not has been questioned following the end of the war. Operation Frequent Wind was generally assessed as an impressive achievement. Doug stated in his memoirs, and the New York Times described it as being carried out with efficiency and bravery. On the other hand, the airlift was also criticized for being too slow and hesitant, and it was inadequate to removing Vietnamese civilians and soldiers who connected with the American presence. The U.S. State Department estimated that the Vietnamese employees of the U.S. Embassy, past and present, and their families totaled about 90,000 people. His testimony in Congress, Martin asserted that 22,294 people were evacuated by the end of April. And an iconic photograph of evacuees entering the Air America helicopter on the roof of the apartment building at 22 Geelong Street is frequently mischaracterized as showing an evacuation from the U.S. Embassy via a military helicopter. But the big thing that everybody tends to forget about and think about is that when the North Vietnamese forces were basically crushing the city, a lot of the civilians were stuck. And they were trying to do everything possible to, not be associated with the Americans. They were getting rid of blue jeans. They were getting rid of sunglasses. They were trying to get rid of, modern forms of clothing. Soldiers, they knew if they were caught in a uniform, they were probably going to get killed. Up until the so-called president, called an end to the whole thing. If they had a rifle, they found a way to get rid of it. Uniforms were discarded. They were piled up, thrown in different places. Some, though, like for example, at that one bridge, they fought on hard at the gate of that one airfield. They put up quite a struggle to keep the air base open. But they were fighting a losing battle, and eventually they wound up surrendering. But that was our date in history, the 30th of April, 1875. That would be 50 years ago. But thank you for following the Bud Files. This is the Bearded Historian, and we will catch you folks next week with another topic.
Have a good day.